Do you like books? I mean, really, really like books? Then you're in the right place. Each week, your host, Sam Hankin, interviews the best of today's top-selling authors and the up-and-coming superstars of modern literature. This is The Avid Reader. Here is your host, Sam Hankin.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of The Avid Reader, brought to you by Wellington Square Bookshop. Our guest today is Alexandra Lang, author of Meet Me by the Fountain, An Inside History of the Mall. Published by Bloomsbury and released, as we speak, today. Alexandra is a design critic. Her essays, reviews, and profiles have appeared in lots of design publications, as well as The Atlantic, New York Magazine, New Yorker, New York Times, and lots of other periodicals. Her previous works include The Design of Childhood, How the Material World Shapes Independent Kids, which is a really cool book. Also writing about architecture, Mastering the Language of Buildings and Cities, the .com City, which is also really interesting, Silicon Valley urbanism. And so she's done lots of other things, got lots of awards. So
we don't need to get into that. Yeah.
I know, it would take forever. You do more in 1 week than I've done the past year. All right, so the mall. One of the things that was so intriguing to me about the book, and Alexandra explores it in her introduction, when she asked her friends about writing about the mall, is that everyone has a backstory about their own mall. Almost if you knew a movie star, like A-list, like I'm 13 minutes away from the King of Prussia Mall, third biggest in the United States, first as far as square footage, retail square footage, or a C- mall like the Exton Mall, also 13 minutes from my house and basically vacant other than the Mainline Health Center and Round One, which is all these video games for kids based on Japanese manga and anime. It was owned by Preet and then just bought by Brandywine Realty Trust for 21 million. 10 years ago, it would have been 210 million. Anyway, so malls are our friends. They're our town squares. They're our sources of disposable clothing, furniture, knickknacks, and tchotchkes. And in the old days, which Alexandra reminded me, browsing the kiosk with my daughter and buying Pogs. And I still don't even know what Pogs are. And then I had my cases for Pogs and all kinds. I have no idea what they are. And of course, the food court. And in the old days, the Dairy Queen with its Orange Julius's, which I miss, and then Gap, Penny, Sears, or the King of Prussia now, Neiman Marcus, Saks, Gucci, Versace, and a score of other right in the new middle part. With the most diverse ethnicities waiting in line for hours to get inside. How did this all happen? What does it mean? And how does a design critic inform us in such a delightful way about these edifices? Seemingly, as Alexandra presages in her epigraph, dropped by a helicopter flown by a blind pilot from some giant architectural supermarket in the sky. So let's meet with Alexandra by the fountain and we'll figure out what all this is about. So welcome, Alexandra, and thanks so much for being with us here today.
Thanks, and thanks for that great intro. See, your two malls are like the perfect ends of the spectrum for what's happening with the mall today. So I can see why you will have liked the book and kind of got the point of it immediately.
Isn't it funny how you said at the beginning when you talk to people that everyone had their own mall? Well, talk about your mall when you were growing up. That's a good way to start out.
Yeah. So I grew up in Durham, North Carolina. So my first mall was Northgate Mall, which was kind of my neighborhood mall. And then as a teenager, I needed slightly, more upscale stores. I wanted to shop at the Gap. So I began hanging out at South Square Mall. And then when I really got into this one brand, Esprit, that other people who grew up in the 80s may remember, I had to go all the way to Raleigh, North Carolina to Crabtree Valley Mall to buy Esprit. So that was kind of the range of malls. Like Northgate was an enclosed mall, but its anchor stores were a Sears and a Belk's, so pretty middle of the road. South Square was slightly nicer. It had 2 stories. It had a fountain. And then Crabtree Valley, which is the only one of the 3 that still exists in some similar form to how it was in the 80s, was like the big super regional mall with kind of luxury stores and a high-end department store.
Isn't it funny how you and I both remember the Gap bags and how they felt? Why were they different? Why was it squishy like that?
I mean, I think the Gap in the 80s and early 90s is still used as a really, really successful example of branding. They had that sans serif type, they had those blue plastic bags, and they just had a really clean, consistent marketing of, like pretty high quality clothes. Like I feel like when I'm shopping today, I'm still looking for 100% cotton clothes, 100% wool sweaters in fun colors. And that was what the Gap sold in those years. And like I would buy all the clothes that I bought from the Gap as a high schooler again now if I could, but they're really hard to find.
Yeah, I know. When I first went to the Gap in 1969, they were still selling Levi's jeans. It had just started, I think, that year.
Yeah, the origins are much more kind of like hippie, trippy.
Right.
I shopped at it in a very preppy era, I would say.
Yeah, kind of like Banana Republic when it really was going on safari to find things. Well, anyway, before we get to the really fun stuff, I guess we should start with our mall heroes, Victor Cruin, and I also guess Lawrence Halprin. So, your essay in the Times just a couple of days ago, and then the review in the LA Times, talk a lot about that and Crystal Palace and that kind of stuff. That'll give a good backdrop for people to understand the beginnings of this whole culture.
Sure. I mean, if you want to go to the kind of the deep origins of the mall are things like the Crystal Palace, which was built in London for the Great Exposition of 1851, or the Galleria Vittorio Emanuele in Milan, which was built in the 1870s. And both of those were these big glass structures designed to kind of contain the world, to bring the world to your city and put it under glass so that you could stroll around and like clean streets with tropical plants and get all your shopping done in one place. So that was a European model that was imported to the US. But then that kind of really sort of beautiful architecture, all day shopping, plants, fountains, was really absorbed and propagated more broadly in the US through department stores, which were really the touchstones of most urban downtowns. And one of the things that I found interesting when I was writing the book was that so many of the families that owned department stores were really important civic leaders, like the Hudson family in Detroit ended up sort of funding the Detroit Institute of the Arts and a lot of other cultural programs. So that's the background. But then post-war America, people start building suburbs, and those suburbs are far from those urban centers, and there's no shopping. There might be a supermarket or a drugstore, but there's no place to shop and hang out. There's no place to meet your friends, for your kids to play during the day. And that's where Victor Cruin, who was a Viennese emigre, comes in and designs the first indoor shopping mall, Southdale, in Edina, Minnesota, in 1956.
Yeah, it's funny. One of the things that was a precursor of that, I guess, and something that I'm fascinated with, I remember Eric Larson's book too, in the 1939 World's Fair, and Futurama, which was so cool and such a hard thing to do. Talk about how that influenced these guys.
Sure. So Victor Cruin, as I said, was Austrian. He was Jewish. He fled the Nazis and came to New York in 1938. And he was already a pretty skilled modernist architect. And the first job he did was to work on the Futurama, which was the General Motors pavilion at the 1938-39 World's Fair in New York. And that pavilion was this kind of giant streamlined building, and people got in by going up a series of ramps. And then when you were inside, you got into a chair that then kind of lifted up and swung you around like a ride over this model of what America was supposed to look like in 1960. And what America was supposed to look like in 1960 was lots of multi-lane highways, skyscrapers in the cities, little towns spread out across the landscape. So, this whole idea of the future was sponsored by GM, designed by Norman Belgettis. And Cruin, like this recent immigrant, was kind of, building the tiny little houses and building the roads on this giant model. So his introduction to America was really this very like car-centric vision of the future. And after that, he began to build his career. He first designed these very beautiful boutiques in New York City, and then he got taken up by the owner of a department store company called Grayson's that began to sort of fly him around the country, and he got into designing department stores, and then through department stores he got into designing malls.
It's funny how when you talk about the architecture and the design, which is what your wheelhouse is, the names like the Garden of Perpetual Spring and the Golden Trees seem so Grecian and so utopian. It was almost like really high culture at that time.
Yeah, I mean, one of the points that like I really emphasize in the book is that the best architects in America were designing malls. And you mentioned the Golden Trees. That was a sculpture at Southdale by Harry Bertoia, who, you know, remains one of the best American post-war sculptors. His work is in lots of civic centers, lots of museums, and it was also just, you know, in this mall in a suburb of Minneapolis. So, I mean, malls in these early days, the 50s, 60s, really were seen as signs of technological progress. They were supposed to be super up to date. You know, they were supposed to be fashionable, just like the clothes that they were selling. And so I think today we have a little bit of a degraded idea of like the mall is just a box and it's only the things inside it that are interesting. But there was a real flair for the dramatic in a lot of the designers of those early malls and in the architecture that they produced.
If you go back to your title, Meet Me by the Fountain, when did the mall become, as it did for me, since I was in the suburbs and you too, because, you know, no one knew where to go to meet. When did it become this thing like the town square, like you'd have in the city where the brass band would play for holidays and things like that? When did that start to emerge?
Well, I think that was really always part of Gruen's original idea. The design of Southdale is really a square atrium in the center with light coming in, and it has a carousel and it has a cafe and it has these sculptures. And I think people really were supposed to use it like a town green, because, you know, it's always been this kind of uneasy combination of community and capitalism, because if you make a mall nice enough, people will see it as a community center and spend time there. But of course, part of the reason you want them to spend time there is so that they will shop and go into more stores. So, you know, it's always this balance of design on the one hand for the sake of design and design that will be most enticing to people.
You know, when you mentioned capitalism, one of the things you bring out in your essay and then again in the review in the LA Times is this, and no, I guess I recognized it, but I wouldn't think of it now, is the idea of how it's like a fancy country club. People were kept out of the mall. People were kept out of the concept of free speech in the mall. People were segregated out of the mall. And it still never became a place where you could do the things you could do outside in public. Talk a little bit about that, and then also another one of my heroes, Thurgood Marshall, his opinion with regard to that.
Yeah. I mean, one of the arguments that I make in the book is that for a lot of places, the mall is the only public space. You know, a lot of towns don't really have town greens anymore. They were built as single family houses and there's no place to gather. So when the mall comes along, it becomes a place to gather. But it can never be as public as, say, you know, the square in the middle of a city, because it is privately owned land and has typically a private police force in the form of security guards and private ownership that can say, you know, when people can come there, how they can gather, what activities are and are not predicated there. And another thing that I go into is just the fact that the mall is an architectural form born out of the suburbs. And as a lot of recent scholarship has shown, you know, America's suburbs were like 99% white, either de facto or de jure. And so any architecture that you're building to serve the suburban population is, for at least, you know, the first 15 to 20 years of its life, meant to serve a white population. So while malls now serve a far more diverse population, because our suburbs are far more diverse than they used to be, their origins are in a kind of separated and segregated, like white suburban America. Yeah, sorry.
No, that's all right.
Yeah.
What I was going to say was that reminded me, like, you know, I went to Mall of America one time when I was at some wedding in Duluth, and I'm never going back to Duluth again. But I guess I shouldn't say that, but it's true. I'm never going to go back. Um, anyway, so I went to Mall America and I was just disgusted. It was horrible. I mean, how many Payless shoe stores can there be in one mall? And then all the theme park aspect of it. But, you know, I had to go to Mall of America. I'm a tourist, essentially. I go to Mall of America. Likewise, King of Prussia, 20% of its patrons are tourists. Maybe more people go there than they go to Independence Hall or the Liberty Bell. So what's that? And also, why is it so different? And there's a complete diversity shift. I mean, those people waiting in line want to be seen waiting in line at Gucci and Versace. It's almost like, you know, Rodeo Drive. And then the other ones just want to go because they think it's an incredible novelty. They want to see it. It's like going to Disney World.
Yeah, I mean, and in fact, when Mall of America first opened, it was treated as a destination like Disney World. There were direct international flights to Minneapolis for people who just wanted to go to the Mall of America, would stay at a hotel on site, would go to the amusement park, etc. So it was a destination. And you're right, today there is a huge amount of basically foreign shopping tourism that goes to all of the highly successful malls. King of Prussia is a great example. I also write in the book about North Park in Dallas and South Coast Plaza in Costa Mesa, California, which have like really high foreign tourist populations. Basically, even international luxury goods are cheaper in the US for many people coming from many of those countries, from Asia and South America. And so it's worth it to them to fly to the US to shop at the boutiques that have, you know, the latest merchandise. And also while they're at it, maybe, you know, sample some other things in the USA. And they like these big, beautiful, very up-to-date luxury malls.
It's funny. I was just thinking, you know, because Philadelphia had Wanamaker's.
Yeah.
And, you know, it's this multi-story department store that still has one of, if not the largest pipe organs in the world. And then on the other side of the ocean is Harrods, which when I go to London, I go to Harrods, I go to the food halls. It's a wonderful experience. Those aren't malls, but they remain and they're prosperous, at least to a certain extent. And few, but the ones that remain are very prosperous.
Yeah. Well, that's exactly the kind of department store that I was talking about
Right.
earlier, that really used to, you know, provide all of the services and kind of social activity that we now associate with malls. That really fell off during the 50s and 60s, partially because of suburbanization. Those downtown department stores just weren't getting the same, you know, density of shopper as they used to, because people had started to live far away. And that's part of the reason that those department stores went into malls and were anchor stores for malls. But it also meant that they cut back on some of the luxuries that they provided in their downtown stores.
Well, so now that we're talking a little bit about what happened to them, I guess we should segue into I guess, you know, what the term even you use, but is pretty much used ubiquitously, is the decaying mall or the death of the mall, which is what's happening at the Exton Mall. You know, you go there and there's nothing there, maybe a tuxedo store or a Middle Eastern store, which actually sometimes you kind of say it's a good idea. But yeah, there's nothing there. And it's depressing. You don't even want to walk around there for exercise.
Yeah, I mean, I agree that dead and dying malls are very depressing. What was interesting to me as I, you know, started pursuing my research was that even with the predicted mall die-off, and there are all kinds of business analysts that are predicting that, I think, you know, like 500 malls are going to die off in the next 5 years, and we'll be left with approximately like 800 malls that are still viable business propositions. Even with that die-off, 800 malls is still a lot of malls. And a bunch of them are really big ones like King of Prussia, but they're also very successful malls that are more, I would say, regionally driven and less internationally driven. But that said, yeah, there are going to be a lot of dying malls. And like one of the things that I really emphasized towards the end of the book are some of the uses that people have already started putting dying malls to, because I think they can really be kind of a black hole within a community. Like if you built the mall as this like geographic center of a community and there are houses all around, and then suddenly there's just this big empty parking lot and an abandoned building in it, or a very like low frequency building, that's really a blot upon the landscape. But it can also be seen as an opportunity to think about what would actually serve this community now. I mean, the mall died because it was no longer serving the community, because the demographics had changed, because there's a nicer mall built 10 miles down the road. I mean, there are all sorts of reasons. So like, what can we do with the mall? You just mentioned, let's see, what were the uses you mentioned for still at the dining mall? A Middle Eastern restaurant actually seems like a great use. A lot of malls, changing with the demographics of their neighborhoods, have been turned into ethnocentric malls that really build on the strengths and the needs of, say, an immigrant population that has taken over a part of town, moved into a part of town, and really is thriving there. Kids' uses are also a big deal. Like you mentioned, an arcade, I think. And at a bunch of malls, the former department stores have been turned into trampoline parks and gymnastics centers and other things like that, because there's a real need for kind of family destinations in the suburbs.
Yeah, Sky Zone. You mentioned Sky Zone.
Yeah. Or Launch is I've taken my kids to Launch, which is in Queens.
I take my grandkids to Sky Zone, and all the worst is Chuck E. Cheese. Chuck E. Cheese just gives me a migraine just being inside there, but the kids love it. And you're torn between, do I want to subject myself to this, or let them enjoy themselves as much as they can and spend $200 or $300 at the same time?
Yeah. I'm the kind of parent who is like, I'll take you to one Chuck E. Cheese birthday party this year. I can only do it once.
Yeah, it's once a year, definitely.
Yeah.
The funny thing is, I talk to lots of people, they talk about climate change or politics or poverty or warfare, and they all seem kind of optimistic. And I'm kind of a fatalist. So your idea of converting some of the malls to public space, to grassland, to community centers and things like that, I would love to believe that. But you talked about capitalism earlier, and what they'll do with the Exton Mall, I know they'll do it, is just knock it down and build the same apartments they're building everywhere with the 3 different outside materials on the facade. There's like brick or stone, then there's wood, then there's that white stucco, and they all look exactly the same, but they make a lot of money, an enormous amount of money. And I tend to think, you even talk about an example where a community wanted what you think is a good idea, but the developers came in and they got their way.
Yeah. No, and that is definitely an issue. I think materials costs are going up. Like one of the points I tried to make is that, like, yes, you can have this kind of beautiful idea that will like take out the mall and the asphalt and grow and have a lawn, but which is one way of doing it. But that is also very wasteful to materials. And I think as the prices of concrete and steel go up, it may start to be like more economically attractive to reuse the bones of these dead malls rather than knocking them down and building something fresh on the same site. I also think you can combine these imperatives. Yes, I think a lot of mall parking lots are great spaces for new housing to be built, especially if it kind of fills in those really like undense edges of mall parking lots. But what about, building apartments around the edge and then reusing the mall as a more perhaps food focused kind of walkable downtown for that new neighborhood that you're building in the parking lot? Like that will also make you money. And that's something that they're doing at Northland, which is one of Victor Gruen's other early mall designs outside of Detroit. They're building apartments in the parking lot and restoring the 1954 part of the shopping center to make it into like little streets and a marketplace and maybe even some co-working spaces.
Yeah, now you think about it, yeah, where the Kmart was next to the Exton Mall, obviously that went out of business. Sears went out of business. So they actually did. They put a Whole Foods in on one side. There's this apartment complex Hanover on the other side. But that comes back to, I guess, one of the especially within the purview of what you've written before, is if I painted you into a corner, maybe I'm not painting you, what's good and what's bad? What are the good spaces? What are the bad spaces? Do you like malls? Would you say that the King of Prussia Mall, for example, is a nice place, a well-designed place, a good place to take your kids, a good place to recreate, to enjoy yourself? Or would you say, no, this is drop from a helicopter?
I haven't actually been to the King of Prussia Mall. I've only driven by it. So I don't know if I could like completely answer that question. Do I like malls? I do like malls. I wouldn't have embarked on this project if I didn't have like fond memories of how the malls operated in my childhood. Within that, like I'm still a design connoisseur. So I think some malls are designed better than others. Like chapter 2 of my book is devoted to North Park, this mall in Dallas that was designed by architects who worked for Eero Saarinen and who worked for Minoru Yamasaki. So like very, very high quality, what we would now call minimalist architecture. And also like a lot of attention to kind of the design details. So it never gets too out of control, unlike a place like the Mall of America used to be, in terms of the colors and the lights and the sounds. So I do think, as I mentioned in the book, when I was young, I did a lot of babysitting, and like I took, the toddler that I was babysitting to the mall all the time. We would get French fries, we would ride the carousel, we would, go to Radio Shack and push some buttons. Like that was a great activity. And I think that really goes back to the origins of the mall as being a place for mothers and children to kind of like get some energy out, see each other, look at things, to kind of not be locked into the single family home.
Yeah, it was funny the way you talked about taking the little girl, you getting the looks because they thought you were a teen mom.
Oh yeah, that was just sort of a funny thing because it took me a while to figure that out. But I did, I spent a lot of Saturday afternoons. The mother of that little girl was actually working on her dissertation, so she just needed time to write. So I would be like taking her out of the house and like, where can we go for 3 hours that doesn't cost a lot and that will be fun for us both?
Yeah, it's that was what I said at the outset, and what you said at the outset too is like, isn't it interesting how we almost anthropomorphize? I mean, it's so clear at what fondness you had at the time for this. There's almost a personal connection, it's almost like a family. You're going to visit your family, and I always wondered how that happened. But when you talk to a kid and you say you're taking them to King of Prussia, they're all excited. They look forward to it. They'll remember it all their lives, like you have. Isn't that interesting?
Yeah. Well, that's another reason that I really wanted to write this book, because I mean, I'm an architecture critic, so obviously I love architecture and have kind of a personal relationship to buildings, but I understand that a lot of people don't feel that way. But I felt that a lot more people felt that way about malls. Like malls were something very familiar that they felt like they understood, that was personal to them. And I just feel like that's always, something that you should be striving for in writing about buildings and talking about buildings, is for people to understand kind of the knowledge of human nature that goes into their design, and how humanity kind of changes them over the years. Like the mall you started out with is not the mall that you ended up with, and that's fine. So if you're trying to write about architecture for a broad audience, you have to pick architecture that people have that kind of connection to. You mentioned my last book at the beginning, The Design of Childhood. And, I have a whole chapter on playgrounds. Everyone's been to a playground. Everyone's been to a mall.
Yeah, that's true. Which reminds me, which I haven't mentioned yet, the illustrations, the photographs throughout. Those were very carefully curated. Talk a little bit about them. Do you have by the way, do you have the book in front of you so you can hold up the cover?
Yes. Wait, I put my lamp on it, but yes. Wait, now
your virtual background or whatever. Yeah, that's.
Okay. Yes.
Well, first of all, because I own a bookstore.
Yeah,
I can see it now. But since I own a bookstore, the two things that are important, really, and publishers are very very strict about this, is the cover of a book, because everyone who comes in, that's what they're looking for, is the cover. That's the only thing they're looking for.
Yeah.
Talk about the mall that's on the cover, and then also we can talk a little bit about the epigraph and why you chose that, but talk a little bit about the cover, because it's really nice.
Thank you. Well, I did a thing that lots of authors do before we started the cover design process, where I went to a local bookstore and looked at all of the looked at all the books in the nonfiction section. And honestly, so many of them had like big block letters in black or white or red, and black and white photos from the past, and they looked so serious. And I did not want my book to look serious, because while I think I talk about a lot of serious things in it, I wanted it to look fun. And the designer for this book is the same designer who designed my last one at Bloomsbury, Katja Nesbit-Posaya. And I think she did a great job, because what she actually did, wait, maybe I should try to hold it up again. A lot of people think, okay, you've got it. All right. So a lot of people think it's one mall on the cover, but it's actually two. The top half is the Lloyd Center in Portland, like a period photo from the early 1960s. And the bottom half is a recent photo of the Mall of America. So she's making this point about how my book sort of starts at the origin of malls and then segues into malls of the present with the two photos on the cover. And then the big dots and the font are supposed to remind you of the wayfinding systems in malls, like meet me by the fountain, the bathrooms are over there, the department store is that way. Like, it's very important. So I love that she managed to kind of infuse it with these clever touches that should remind you of actually physically being at the mall.
Yeah, it's not that it's whimsical, but it's pleasant, and it's nostalgic, as you said, because it's taking the past, and then you go, oh, well, this is modern now. But you have to pick it up and look at it before you're going to catch that. But there's something about it that's going to make you pick it up because of that dichotomy. Yeah. As a bookseller, it's just, it's clear that that's what was going on. So it's really good, and the colors are really good too.
Yeah, well, she knows that I like bright colors, so I feel like that's a little bit of a tip of her hat to my taste, which I appreciate.
And the epigraph. So I was asking whether you like malls or not, and the epigraph doesn't really lead you into the book thinking.
Oh, yeah, that's a little bit of a personal in-joke. Yeah. So the epigraph, wait, should I read it? Let me see.
Yeah, read it.
Epigraph is, they look as if they have been dropped by a helicopter flown by a blind pilot from some great architectural supermarket in the sky. So that is a quote from Ada Louise Huxtable, the longtime New York Times architecture critic and one of my personal heroes, from a piece she wrote for the Times in 1976 called Schlockton Greets You. So I put that there, not because I agree with her point of view, but to kind of indicate that was the point of view of architecture critics about malls for a long time. Even Ada Louise Huxtable, who, like one of my heroes, and also Michael Sorkin, another architecture critic who I quote in the introduction, also a hero of mine and a friend, he also hated malls. So for me to write this book and try to convince people that actually malls are good was I needed to slough off some of the shadows of my forebears. So that's why I picked that epigraph, because I think it's a great piece of writing, but I actually think it's a little bit of a blinkered point of view on what malls have evolved into in terms of how meaningful they are to people and what kind of community space they often are.
Yeah, and with regard to that, now there's this new thing, like across from King of Prussia, there's this gigantic, what is it? A village, a town that has beautiful streets, on-street parking, a lovely green with artificial grass, beautiful artificial grass though, and a Fogo de Chao, an REI, which is this big sporting goods place around here, a Founding Farmers, aristocratic donut shops, and then surrounding that are those apartments I talked about. Mm-hmm. And the kids in those apartments, and they're generally kids or young married adults with no children, they may never have children, they're in there, they don't have to ever cook, They can go out to 20 or 30 different restaurants.
Mhm.
They have no intention of ever mowing a lawn. They have no intention of ever shoveling snow or paying real estate taxes. They'll probably move in 3 or 4 years. They're not going to live in a house for 30 years and burn the mortgage. It's a completely different thing. And they love being there. They are as happy as someone could possibly
Mhm.
be, as long as their Whole Foods is close by.
Yeah. Well, that is a kind of, mini urbanism. Like maybe what they really would like to do is to live in a center city, but like those have generally become prohibitively expensive. So they pick what is essentially like a mini town with all of these urban amenities. And they realize that their kids will be just as happy kind of playing on that artificial green with other kids as they would be if they had their own backyard. Everyone doesn't need a tiny backyard. Like you can have essentially a communal backyard. So that sounds all right to me, except I suspect that they all have to like drive long distances to their jobs, which is not great. But in terms of their home life, that sounds pretty good.
And another one of the COVID paradoxes is maybe they don't have to drive to their job anymore.
Right. Well, that's why I think actually co-working spaces are another newish use that may go into a lot of old malls, because it's like, yes, you can work from home now, but do you have the space at home or the privacy or the quiet that you need? Maybe not, but you want a co-working space that's within walking or short driving distance of your house rather than like all the way back downtown where your office might have been.
You touch on some of the artifacts, some not artifacts, like semi-pejorative term mall rats, the security guards on segways, pretty much the only people who use segways. And, again, we talked about the prohibition against protest, even maybe chewing gum. And there's all these little things that you touch upon that are touchstones to people who are reading the book. They go, oh yeah, that's right. I forgot about this. The mall cops or the movie Mall Cop.
Yeah, I feel like one that comes up a lot is Orange Julius.
And I said,
yes, yes. I mean, at my mall, at South Square Mall, in Durham, the food court was, as it often is, on the second story, sort of overlooking the central atrium area, and there was an Orange Julius kiosk like right at the front of it. So that was kind of the brand that welcomed you. They had that great sign with the big orange. It's like very striking, and so many people remember Orange Julius. And I have in a section in the book where I try to offer like a short history of what I call kind of sugary mall snacks. Like I think when teenagers go to the mall, they generally don't have a lot of spending money, but they want to treat themselves. So a sugary snack is like the ideal way to treat yourself. And there have been a number of food brands that have done really well at malls, and Orange Julius is one of them, that essentially sold like a low cost kind of showy sugar product. Mrs. Fields cookies, Cinnabon, Orange Julius. Then, there was a big wave of smoothie shops when people were pretending to be more healthy. And nowadays, I think what a lot of the teenagers want to drink is bubble tea or boba, which is, I think, kind of just an updated version of Orange Julius.
I don't know what they put in Orange Julius that made it addictive, because there really shouldn't have been anything in there, but there's nothing else that tastes like it. And the other thing, the one you missed, is Auntie Anne's, which I've never,
right.
And I don't understand how there could be lines at a place like that. That's because I'm old. But yeah, there's
Auntie Anne's is still popular.
Yeah.
It's hanging on. Yeah.
It definitely is. Well, in the King of Prussia, they have the low-end food court, and then when you go into the Galleria, you have the high-end food court, which is also hilarious in my opinion. But which brings me, I guess, another thing we didn't talk about yet was malls in other countries, and the idea of having transit that goes directly to the mall, especially thinking now about $5 gas and maybe more. And they're trying to do that here with light rail and buses, so people can come from the city who otherwise wouldn't be able to afford to even get there. So how do foreign malls differ? How do malls in others? I've been to malls in China that are completely different, and they still use the abacus to check you out.
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest difference between, and this is like very generally speaking, since there are a lot of countries and each one has a different cuts, but I think in a lot of places, including Asia and South America, malls have been built as part of transit-oriented development. So they're built at the same time as housing and funded by some of the same organizations. And they are accessed by public transit, and they're also much more vertical because land is more costly where they're building, and they're trying to build the housing close in. So you're not, walking across a parking lot to get to the housing, but it's like right across the street, or maybe accessible through a skyway or a tunnel for the mall. So you see many like much higher malls, like 6, 7 stories, and those will all be accessed by subway or tramway from the bottom. And that's just not really how malls developed in this country. I mean, malls were developed for car suburbs, sort of parallel and slightly after building new highways, building single family homes. So our malls, by and large, tend to be, flat and horizontal, whereas in dense cities, in places like China, the malls grow up from the sidewalk like their own form of skyscraper.
Yeah, the malls in China were fascinating to me. Guangzhou, Hong Kong, Shanghai. Yeah, you're right. They were very tall, tons escalators forever.
Mm-hmm.
And then it was very modern, but then again, checking it. And then you'd have people wait on you that would serve you in each store.
Yeah.
Plenty of people. It was fascinating.
Yeah.
I guess in conclusion, it's really easy for me to figure out how to conclude, because the title of your essay just a couple of days ago, maybe, I don't know if you titled it, is "Get In, We're Going to Save Them All." And then the one in the LA Times is kind of Trumpian, "How to Make Malls Great Again, or maybe for the first time." So that kind of goes like, okay, where do both of those essays, the essay and the review, where are they going? Because the headline says, we're about ready to do something. Let's go ahead and do this. What is it we're going to do?
Well, first of all, we're going to stop saying that, like all the malls are dead. Like, I think both of those headlines are basically like in reaction to, I think, a sort of general assumption that like all the malls are dying, when really it's only some of the malls are dying. And then it's saying there's actually something that we can do about this, that, it's not kind of malls are dead, the end, this is this blank space in our city, but in fact, people, smart designers, smart developers, smart, politicians have already started thinking about how to save the mall, like what could go into a mall that would be good for the community, though not, which is not necessarily in every case shopping. So I think it's trying to kind of bring some energy and creativity back to the idea of the mall. And one of the things that I'm definitely at pains to point out is that the mall started out as a pretty creative space, like a pretty spectacular space where you could see the latest in architecture and design along with the latest in fashion. And there's no reason that kind of creativity can't come back again.
Yeah, it's funny. Again, at my bookstore, Wellington Square Bookshop, you remember how it used to say on mattresses, do not remove under penalty of law?
Yeah.
Did you rip them off? I ripped them off. My brother and I.
No, I feel like people never read. Isn't there a line right under that says like until you buy it, or like until it's in your home or something like that?
I don't know. We ignored that. We just like breaking the law, breaking the law. But so I got your book before June 14th, and you're not supposed to set it out, which I don't. But one of the young women who works there, she goes, "Is it illegal for me to take this and read it?" And I said, "No, I think you can do it. I don't know when the book police are coming by, but I think read it and then just put it back real quick." But
I have had to explain pub dates to so many people, though I'm not sure I actually understand the reason for it. But I have been like, no, you're not supposed to see it in a store until June 14th.
I know. It's like Harry Potter and waiting till midnight. Although this is a different crowd. Maybe not. Maybe it is part of the same. Actually, it is part of the same crowd. Well, in any event, Alexandra, thanks so much. It's Meet Me by the Fountain, an inside history of the mall. And as I said, as we're talking today, it's just been published. And I know someone who got it on their Kindle at 12:01 a.m. So that's really fun too. So thanks again for being here. It was a pleasure talking to you, and it's a great story and hopefully a great future too.
Great. Well, thanks so much for having me. And I really appreciate the enthusiasm.
Thanks.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye.